What are you doing? Who are you?
My name is Brown. Miss Rome sent for me, and I came as quickly as I could,
said the priest sadly, as he bent over something and straightened himself again.
I've come too late.
Welcome to Meteoread Audiobooks, your best companion, where classic tales are brought to life like never before. A glamorous actress, a love triangle, and a shocking murder in a darkened theatre leave the world stunned. Witnesses claim to have seen a mysterious man in the passage just before the crime. But who is he, and what part did he play? As suspicion grows, Father Brown steps in to untangle a web of jealousy, deception, and hidden truths. You are listening to The Man in the Passage, a riveting mystery by G.K. Chesterton, first published in 1914 as part of his Father Brown series. Think of it as a Netflix show without the visuals. Now, dim the lights, settle in, and let the mystery sweep you off your feet. The truth hides in plain sight.
Two men appeared simultaneously at the two ends of a sort of passage running along the side of the Apollo Theatre in the Adelphi. The evening daylight in the streets was large and luminous, opalescent and empty. The passage was comparatively long and dark, so each man could see the other as a mere black silhouette at the other end. Nevertheless, each man knew the other, even in that inky outline, for they were both men of striking appearance, and they hated each other. The covered passage opened on one end to a steep street in the Adelphi, and on the other to a terrace overlooking the sunset-hued river. One side was a blank wall of an old, now-closed theatre restaurant. The other contained two doors, one at each end, neither the usual stage door but private entrances for the star actor and actress of the Shakespearean performance. Such doors often allowed eminent performers to meet friends or avoid them. The two men approaching the upper door clearly knew and relied on its opening. One walked faster but came from farther, so both arrived nearly simultaneously. They greeted civilly before the quicker man, with less patience, knocked. In every way they were opposites yet equals. Handsome, capable, and popular, both were prominent figures of entirely different kinds. Sir Wilson Seymour was a man whose influence was apparent to those in elite circles, omnipresent on committees ranging from Royal Academy reforms to Greater Britain's bimetallism. In the arts, he was supreme, embodying both aristocratic gravitas and artistic flair. His appearance, from his slightly elevated silk hat to his pointed beard, was distinguished yet unique, evoking the admirals of Velázquez's portraits. The other man, though not as tall, exuded strength and command. His fair, cropped hair framed a massive head reminiscent of Chaucer's Miller. His military moustache and square shoulders marked him as a soldier, while his piercing blue sailor's eyes lent a frankness to his strong, square face. A caricature once depicted him as a Euclidean proposition. Captain Cutler, unlike Seymour, was widely recognized by the public. Renowned for the siege of Hong Kong and the march across China, his fame was everywhere, on postcards, in illustrated papers, and even in barrel organ songs. Though less powerful in England than Seymour, he loomed large in popular imagination, akin to Nelson in countless homes. The door was opened by an aged servant, or dresser, whose shabby appearance contrasted sharply with the dazzling interior of the actress's dressing room. Mirrors at every angle created a kaleidoscopic effect, turning a few flowers, cushions, and scraps of costume into an Arabian Nights spectacle. The attendants shuffled mirrors, shifting reflections into a mesmerizing dance. Both men addressed the dresser, Parkinson, asking for Miss Aurora Rome. Parkinson informed them she was in the adjoining room, with a great actor she performed alongside. A shadow crossed both men's faces, as Aurora was the kind of woman to spark both admiration and jealousy. Moments later, she appeared with her usual commanding presence, clad in peacock green and blue satins that gleamed like metals. Her striking face, framed by heavy brown hair, captivated men of all ages. Aurora and Isidore Bruno, her American colleague, were performing a dreamy interpretation of Midsummer Night's Dream, where her costume as Titania accentuated her ethereal allure. She greeted both men with her enigmatic smile, accepting extravagant tropical flowers from Cutler and, later, a curious gift from Seymour. True to his nature, Seymour nonchalantly presented an ancient Greek dagger from the Mycenaean epoch, a brass blade sharp enough to still prick. Its leaf-like design resembled a Greek vase and might even suit the play's aesthetic. Suddenly, the inner door burst open, revealing Isidore Bruno, towering at nearly 6'6". Draped in leopard skin and golden brown Oberon robes, he exuded barbaric grandeur. Leaning on a hunting spear which seemed like a delicate wand on stage but loomed as a menacing pike in the small room, Bruno's imposing presence silenced further conversation. His vivid black eyes rolled volcanically. His bronzed face, handsome as it was, showed at that moment a combination of high cheekbones with set white teeth, which recalled certain American conjectures about his origin in the southern plantations. He began in that deep voice like a drum of passion that had moved so many audiences.
Aurora, will you...
He stopped indecisively because a sixth figure had suddenly presented itself just inside the doorway, a figure so incongruous in the scene as to be almost comic. It was a very short man in the black uniform of the Roman secular clergy, and looking, especially in such a presence as Bruno's and Aurora's, rather like the wooden Noah out of an ark. He did not, however, seem conscious of any contrast, but said with dull civility,
"I believe Miss Rome sent for me."
A shrewd observer might have remarked that the emotional temperature rather rose at so unemotional an interruption. The detachment of a professional celibate highlighted to the others that they formed a ring of amorous rivals around Miss Rome, much like frost on a stranger's coat emphasizes the warmth of a furnace. His indifference magnified her sense that everyone else was dangerously in love with her. The actor with the raw appetite of a savage child, the soldier with selfish resolve, Sir Wilson with the hardened focus of an aging hedonist, and even Parkinson, the abject servant, whose devotion resembled that of a dog. A shrewd observer might notice something stranger still. The wooden-faced man, not devoid of shrewdness himself, found it quietly amusing. Miss Rome, far from indifferent to male admiration, seemed intent on expelling her admirers to be alone with the one man who didn't adore her, at least not in that way. The priest, however, appreciated her deft handling of the situation, her diplomatic mastery over one half of humanity, the other half. He watched her maneuvers like a military campaign, noting her precision in removing all without offending anyone. Bruno, the actor, was easily dismissed in a storm of childish sulks slamming the door. Cutler, the officer, was impervious to subtlety but bound by duty. He could ignore hints but never a direct request from a lady. Seymour, the most complex, required careful handling. He had to be appealed to as an old confidant, let in on the secret purpose of clearing the room. The priest did really admire Miss Rome as she achieved all these three objects in one selected action. She went across to Captain Cutler and said in her sweetest manner,
"I shall value all these flowers because they must be your favourite flowers, but they won't be complete, you know, without my favourite flower. Do go over to that shop round the corner and get me some lilies of the valley, and then it will be quite lovely."
The first object of her diplomacy, the exit of the enraged Bruno, was at once achieved. He had already handed his spear in a lordly style like a sceptre to the piteous Parkinson, and was about to assume one of the cushioned seats like a throne. But at this open appeal to his rival, there glowed in his opal eyeballs all the sensitive insolence of the slave. He knotted his enormous brown fists for an instant, and then, dashing open the door, disappeared into his own apartments beyond. But meanwhile, Miss Rome's experiment in mobilizing the British Army had not succeeded so simply as seemed probable. Cutler had indeed risen stiffly and suddenly and walked towards the door, hatless, as if at a word of command. But perhaps there was something ostentatiously elegant about the languid figure of Seymour leaning against one of the looking-glasses that brought him up short at the entrance, turning his head this way and that like a bewildered bulldog.
"I must show this stupid man where to go,"
said Aurora in a whisper to Seymour, and ran out to the threshold to speed the parting guest. Seymour appeared to be listening, his posture elegant and unaware, and seemed relieved when he heard the lady give some last instructions to the captain, then turn and laugh as she ran down the passage toward the terrace above the Thames. Yet, a moment later, his brow darkened again. A man in his position has so many rivals, and he remembered the corresponding entrance at the other end of the passage leading to Bruno's private room. He maintained his dignity, offering Father Brown some polite words on the revival of Byzantine architecture in Westminster Cathedral, before strolling out to the passage's upper end. Father Brown and Parkinson were left alone, both disinclined toward unnecessary conversation. The dresser moved about, shifting looking-glasses in and out, his dingy coat more dismal in contrast to the festive fairy spear of King Oberon he still held. Each time a new mirror was adjusted, another black figure of Father Brown appeared, multiplying in the absurd glass chamber, performing somersaults like acrobats, or turning their backs like rude persons. Father Brown seemed quite unconscious of this cloud of witnesses, but followed Parkinson with an idly attentive eye till he took himself and his absurd spear into the farther room of Bruno. Then he abandoned himself to such abstract meditations as always amused him, calculating the angles of the mirrors, the angles of each refraction, the angle at which each must fit into the wall. When he heard a strong but strangled cry, he sprang to his feet and stood rigidly listening. At the same instant, Sir Wilson Seymour burst back into the room, white as ivory.
"Who's that man in the passage? Where's that dagger of mine?"
Before Father Brown could turn in his heavy boots, Seymour was plunging about the room looking for the weapon. And before he could possibly find that weapon or any other, a brisk running of feet broke upon the pavement outside, and the square face of Cutler was thrust into the same doorway. He was still grotesquely grasping a bunch of lilies of the valley.
What's this? What's that creature down the passage? Is this some of your tricks?
"My tricks?"
hissed his pale rival, and made a stride towards him. In the instant of time in which all this happened, Father Brown stepped out into the top of the passage, looked down it, and at once walked briskly towards what he saw. At this, the other two men dropped their quarrel and darted after him, Cutler calling out,
What are you doing? Who are you?
My name is Brown. Miss Rome sent for me, and I came as quickly as I could.
said the priest sadly, as he bent over something and straightened himself again.
I've come too late.
The three men looked down, and in one of them at least the life died in that late light of afternoon. It ran along the passage like a path of gold, and in the midst of it Aurora Rome lay lustrous in her robes of green and gold, with her dead face turned upwards. Her dress was torn away as in a struggle, leaving the right shoulder bare, but the wound from which the blood was welling was on the other side. The brass dagger lay flat and gleaming a yard or so away. There was a blank stillness for a measurable time, so that they could hear far off a flower girl's laugh outside Charing Cross, and someone whistling furiously for a taxicab in one of the streets off the Strand. Then the captain, with a movement so sudden that it might have been passion or play acting, took Sir Wilson Seymour by the throat. Seymour looked at him steadily without either fight or fear.
"You need not kill me. I shall do that on my own account."
The captain's hand hesitated and dropped, and the other added with the same icy candour,
"If I find I haven't the nerve to do it with that dagger, I can do it in a month with drink."
Drink isn't good enough for me, but I'll have blood for this before I die. Not yours, but I think I know whose.
And before the others could appreciate his intention, he snatched up the dagger, sprang at the other door at the lower end of the passage, burst it open, bolt and all, and confronted Bruno in his dressing room. As he did so, old Parkinson tottered in his wavering way out of the door and caught sight of the corpse lying in the passage. He moved shakily towards it, looked at it weakly with a working face, then moved shakily back into the dressing room again and sat down suddenly on one of the richly cushioned chairs. Father Brown instantly ran across to him, taking no notice of Cutler and the colossal actor, though the room already rang with their blows and they began to struggle for the dagger. Seymour, who retained some practical sense, was whistling for the police at the end of the passage. When the police arrived, it was to tear the two men from an almost ape-like grapple, and after a few formal inquiries, to arrest Isidore Bruno upon a charge of murder brought against him by his furious opponent. The idea that the great national hero of the hour had arrested a wrongdoer with his own hand doubtless had its weight with the police, who were not without elements of the journalist. They treated Cutler with a certain solemn attention and pointed out that he had got a slight slash on the hand. Even as Cutler bore him back across tilted chair and table, Bruno had twisted the dagger out of his grasp and disabled him just below the wrist. The injury was really slight, but till he was removed from the room, the half-savage prisoner stared at the running blood with a steady smile.
Hey, you still there? Sorry for jumping in while you're listening. Just wanted to quickly mention that we publish stories like this every Sunday. If you're enjoying it, consider subscribing for more. Happy listening.
Looks a cannibal sort of chap, don't he?
Said the constable confidentially to Cutler. Cutler made no answer, but said sharply a moment after,
We must attend to the death.
The two deaths. This poor fellow was gone when I got across to him,"
came in the voice of the priest from the farther side of the room, and he stood looking down at old Parkinson, who sat in a black huddle on the gorgeous chair. He also had paid his tribute, not without eloquence, to the woman who had died. The silence was first broken by Cutler, who seemed not untouched by a rough tenderness.
I wish I was him. I remember he used to watch her wherever she walked more than anybody. She was his heir, and he's dried up. He's just dead."
We are all dead.
Said Seymour in a strange voice, looking down the road. They took leave of Father Brown at the corner of the road, with some random apologies for any rudeness they might have shown. Both their faces were tragic, but also cryptic. The mind of the little priest was always a rabbit warren of wild thoughts that jumped too quickly for him to catch them. Like the white tail of a rabbit, he had the vanishing thought that he was certain of their grief, but not so certain of their innocence.
We had better all be going. We have done all we can to help.
"Will you understand my motives if I say you have done all you can to hurt?"
They both started as if guiltily, and Cutler said sharply,
To hurt whom?
"To hurt yourselves. I would not add to your troubles if it weren't common justice to warn you. You've done nearly everything you could do to hang yourselves. If this actor should be acquitted, they'll be sure to subpoena me. I shall be bound to say that after the cry was heard, each of you rushed into the room in a wild state and began quarrelling about a dagger. As far as my words on oath can go, you might either of you have done it. You hurt yourselves with that. And then Captain Cutler must have hurt himself with the dagger."
Hurt myself, a silly little scratch.
"Which drew blood. We know there's blood on the brass now, and so we shall never know whether there was blood on it before."
There was a silence, and then Seymour said,
But I saw a man in the passage.
"I know you did. So did Captain Cutler. That's what seems so improbable."
Before either could make sufficient sense of it even to answer, Father Brown had politely excused himself and gone stumping up the road with his stumpy old umbrella. As modern newspapers are run, the most honest and important news is the police news. If it's true that the 20th century gives more space to murder than politics, it's because murder is a more serious subject. But even this doesn't fully explain the immense coverage of the Bruno case, or the Passage mystery in the London and provincial press. The excitement was so vast that, for weeks, the press told the truth. The interminable and even intolerable reports of examination and cross-examination were at least reliable. The real reason was the coincidence of persons. The victim was a popular actress, the accused was a popular actor, and the accused had been caught red-handed by the most popular soldier of the patriotic season. In these extraordinary circumstances, the press was forced into probity and accuracy, and the rest of the story can largely be recounted from reports of Bruno's trial. The trial was presided over by Mr. Justice Monkhouse, a judge often mocked for his humour, though in reality much more serious than his solemn counterparts. All the chief actors being of worldly importance, the barristers were well matched. The prosecutor, Sir Walter Cowdray, a heavy yet weighty advocate, and the prisoner defended by Mr. Patrick Butler, K.C., who was misjudged by those unfamiliar with the Irish character, and those not examined by him. The medical evidence had no contradictions, with the Dr. Seymour summoned agreeing with the eminent surgeon who later examined the body. Aurora Rome had been stabbed with a sharp instrument, likely a knife or dagger, with a short blade just over the heart, causing instant death. When the doctor first saw her, she had hardly been dead for 20 minutes. Thus, when Father Brown found her, she could hardly have been dead for 3. Some official detective evidence followed, mainly about the presence or absence of any proof of a struggle. The only suggestion was the tearing of the dress at the shoulder, which didn't seem to fit the direction or finality of the blow. Once these details had been provided, though not explained, the first important witness was called. Sir Wilson Seymour gave his evidence as he did everything, perfectly. Though more of a public figure than the judge, he conveyed the right shade of self-effacement before the King's justice. Though everyone looked at him like they would at the Prime Minister or Archbishop of Canterbury, they could only say his part was that of a private gentleman, with emphasis on the noun. He was also refreshingly lucid, as he was on committees. He had been calling on Miss Rome at the theatre when he met Captain Cutler. They had been joined briefly by the accused, who then returned to his dressing room. They were soon joined by a Roman Catholic priest, who asked for the deceased lady and gave his name as Brown. Miss Rome had then gone just outside the theatre to point out a flower shop to Captain Cutler. and the witness had stayed in the room speaking briefly with the priest. He had then clearly heard the deceased turn around laughing and run down the passage toward the other end, where the prisoner's dressing room was. Out of idle curiosity, he had strolled to the head of the passage and looked down toward the prisoner's door. Did he see anything? Yes, he saw something. Sir Walter Cowdray allowed an impressive interval, during which the witness looked down and for all his usual composure seemed to have more than his usual pallor. Then the barrister said in a lower voice, which seemed at once sympathetic and creepy,
"Did you see it distinctly?"
Sir Wilson Seymour, however moved, had his excellent brains in full working order.
Very distinctly as regards its outline, but quite indistinctly, indeed not at all, as regards the details inside the outline. The passage is of such length that anyone in the middle of it appears quite black against the light at the other end. I had noticed the fact before when Captain Cutler first entered it.
There was another silence, and the judge leaned forward and made a note.
Well, what was the outline like? Was it, for instance, like the figure of the murdered woman?
Not in the least.
What did it look like to you?
It looked to me like a tall man.
Everyone in court kept his eyes riveted on his pen or his umbrella handle or his book or his boots or whatever he happened to be looking at. They seemed to be holding their eyes away from the prisoner by main force, but they felt his figure in the dock, and they felt it as gigantic. Tall as Bruno was to the eye, he seemed to swell taller and taller when an eyes had been torn away from him. Cowdray was resuming his seat with his solemn face, smoothing his black silk robes and white silk whiskers. Sir Wilson was leaving the witness box after a few final particulars to which there were many other witnesses, when the counsel for the defence sprang up and stopped him.
"I shall only detain you a moment,"
said Mr. Butler, who was a rustic-looking person with red eyebrows and an expression of partial slumber.
"Will you tell his lordship how you knew it was a man?"
A faint, refined smile seemed to pass over Seymour's features.
I'm afraid it is the vulgar test of trousers. When I saw daylight between the long legs, I was sure it was a man, after all.
After all? So you did think at first it was a woman?
It is hardly a point of fact, but if his lordship would like me to answer for my impression, of course I shall do so. There was something about the thing that was not exactly a woman, and yet was not quite a man. Somehow the curves were different, and it had something that looked like long hair.
"Thank you,"
said Mr. Butler, KC, and sat down suddenly, as if he had got what he wanted. Captain Cutler was a far less plausible and composed witness than Sir Wilson, but his account of the opening incidents was solidly the same. He described the return of Bruno to his dressing room, the dispatching of himself to buy a bunch of lilies of the valley, his return to the upper end of the passage, the thing he saw in the passage, his suspicion of Seymour, and his struggle with Bruno. But he could give little artistic assistance about the black figure that he and Seymour had seen. Asked about its outline, he said he was no art critic, with a somewhat too obvious sneer at Seymour. Asked if it was a man or a woman, he said it looked more like a beast, with a too obvious snarl at the prisoner. But the man was plainly shaken with sorrow and sincere anger, and Cowdray quickly excused him from confirming facts that were already fairly clear. The defending counsel also was again brief in his cross-examination, although, as was his custom, even in being brief, he seemed to take a long time about it.
"You used a rather remarkable expression. What do you mean by saying that it looked more like a beast than a man or a woman?"
Perhaps I oughtn't to have said that, but when the brute has huge humped shoulders like a chimpanzee and bristles sticking out of its head like a pig...
Never mind whether its hair was like a pig's. Was it like a woman's?
A woman's? Great Scott, no!
The last witness said it was. And did the figure have any of those serpentine and semi-feminine curves to which eloquent allusion has been made? No. No feminine curves. The figure, if I understand you, was rather heavy and square than otherwise.
He may have been bending forward.
Or again, he may not,
said Mr. Butler, and sat down suddenly for the second time. The third witness called by Sir Walter Cowdray was the little Catholic clergyman, so little compared with the others that his head seemed hardly to come above the box, so that it was like cross-examining a child. But unfortunately, Sir Walter had somehow got it into his head, mostly by some ramifications of his family's religion, that Father Brown was on the side of the prisoner, because the prisoner was wicked and foreign and even partly black. Therefore, he took Father Brown up sharply whenever that proud pontiff tried to explain anything, and told him to answer yes or no, and tell the plain facts without any Jesuitry. When Father Brown began, in his simplicity, to say who he thought the man in the passage was, the barrister told him that he did not want his theories.
A black shape was seen in the passage, and you say you saw the black shape. Well, what shape was it?
Father Brown blinked as under rebuke, but he had long known the literal nature of obedience.
The shape was short and thick, but had two sharp black projections curved upwards on each side of the head or top, rather like horns, and—
Oh, the devil with horns, no doubt. It was the devil come to eat Protestants.
No, I know who it was.
Those in court had been wrought up to an irrational, but real sense of some monstrosity. They had forgotten the figure in the dock and thought only of the figure in the passage. And the figure in the passage, described by 3 capable and respectable men who had all seen it, was a shifting nightmare. One called it a woman, and the other a beast, and the other a devil. The judge was looking at Father Brown with level and piercing eyes.
You are a most extraordinary witness, but there is something about you that makes me think you are trying to tell the truth. Well, who was the man you saw in the passage?
He was myself.
Butler Casey sprang to his feet in an extraordinary stillness and said quite calmly,
Your lordship will allow me to cross-examine?
And then, without stopping, he shot at Brown the apparently disconnected question.
You have heard about this dagger. You know the experts say the crime was committed with a short blade.
A short blade, but a very long hilt.
Before the audience could quite dismiss the idea that the priest had really seen himself doing murder with a short dagger with a long hilt, which seemed somehow to make it more horrible, he had himself hurried on to explain.
I mean, daggers aren't the only things with short blades. Spears have short blades, and spears catch at the end of the steel just like daggers. If they're that sort of fancy spear they had in theatres, like the spear poor old Parkinson killed his wife with, just when she'd sent for me to settle their family troubles. And I came just too late, God forgive me. But he died penitent. He just died of being penitent. He couldn't bear what he'd done.
The general impression in court was that the little priest, who was gobbling away, had literally gone mad in the box. But the judge still looked at him with bright and steady eyes of interest, and the counsel for the defence went on with his questions unperturbed.
If Parkinson did it with that pantomime spear, he must have thrust from 4 yards away. How do you account for signs of struggle, like the dress dragged off the shoulder?
The poor lady's dress was torn because it was caught in a panel that slid to just behind her. She struggled to free herself, and as she did so, Parkinson came out of the prisoner's room and lunged with the spear.
A panel?
It was a looking glass on the other side. When I was in the dressing room, I noticed that some of them could probably be slid out into the passage.
There was another vast and unnatural silence, and this time it was the judge who spoke.
So you really mean that when you looked down that passage, the man you saw was yourself, in a mirror?
Yes, my lord. That was what I was trying to say. But they asked me for the shape, and our hats have corners just like horns, and so I—
Do you really mean to say that when Sir Wilson Seymour saw that wild, what you call him, with curves, and a woman's hair, and a man's trousers, what he saw was Sir Wilson Seymour?
Yes, my lord.
And you mean to say that when Captain Cutler saw that chimpanzee with humped shoulders and hog's bristles, he simply saw himself?
Yes, my lord.
The judge leaned back in his chair with a luxuriance in which it was hard to separate the cynicism and the admiration.
And can you tell us why you should know your own figure in a looking glass, when 2 such distinguished men don't?
Father Brown blinked even more painfully than before. Then he stammered,
Really, my lord, I don't know unless it's because I don't look at it so often.